I wanted to thank everyone for being here today. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to learn from our panel as they engage around the critical struggle for Black liberation. My name is Brinda Sarathy, and I'm a professor of environmental analysis and director of the Robert Redford Conservancy for Southern California Sustainability at Pitzer College. The Redford Conservancy is committed to using our resources to facilitate safe and meaningful access for all people to learn from the natural world, to educating and advocating for environmental and social justice, and to honoring the sacredness and interconnectedness of all beings. We are resolved to work for a world in which Black lives truly matter. In so doing, we will also realize a society that is ultimately more humane, more just, and more sustaining of all breath and all beings. We have asked our speakers today to engage with the struggle for Black liberation and social protest movements in the context of state-sanctioned and extrajudicial violence. Each panelist will speak to this topic from their arenas of expertise and analysis. I'll briefly introduce the panel in order of their remarks, followed by moderated discussion. There will be time for Q&A from the audience, when you are all welcome to use the Q&A and raise hand feature to ask questions. This session is being recorded, and we acknowledge the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Justice Education Project at the Claremont Colleges for their support in helping to sponsor this event. We will begin with Omar Waslow. Omar Waslow is an assistant professor in Princeton's Department of Politics. His research on race and the political consequences of nonviolent and violent protests has been featured in the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, as well as very recently in the prestigious academic venue, the American Political Science Review. Before joining the Academy, Professor Waslow co-founded BlackPlanet.com, a social network he helped grow to over 3 million active users. Dr. Waslow received a PhD in African American Studies, an MA in Government, and an MA in Statistics from Harvard University. After Dr. Waslow, we will have Professor Robyn Spencer, who is an associate professor of history at Lehman College. Her research focuses on Black social protest after World War II, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. In 2016, Professor Spencer published her first book about the Black freedom movement titled The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland. She is currently completing her second book, To Build the World Anew, Black Liberation Politics and the Movement Against the Vietnam War. You can follow Dr. Spencer on Twitter at RaceWomanist. Brontë Velez will be our third panelist. Bronte's work and rest is guided by the call that Black wellness is the antithesis to state violence. As a transdisciplinary artist, ecologist, and wake worker, their eco-social art practice lives at the intersections of Black feminist placemaking, prophetic community traditions, and environmental justice. Brontë Velez serves as creative director for Led to Life, a collective of artists, healers, and ecologists transforming guns into the otherwise through ceremony. They also serve as an educator for Weaving Earth, Center for Relational Education, whose practice is centered on ecological connection to transform social systems. Finally, Tyee Griffith is manager for the Justice Education Project at the Claremont Colleges. She is a doctoral student in the Political Science and Government Department at Claremont Graduate University and has over 20 years of experience working in the justice system and in higher education. Ms. Griffith's work focuses on the criminalization of Black people in the United States of America, recidivism, and reentry services for formerly incarcerated individuals, and the use of education as a tool for community empowerment. Tyee and I will together moderate today's conversation. And with that, we will turn to Dr. Waslow.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to begin with just a very simple slideshow. Let me start with that. I want to, in particular, let's see, and I think you need to turn on my video, I think. Unless, for now, I can just do the slides if that's, okay, yeah. Let me begin just by saying thank you. It's an honor to be a part of this panel. I'm grateful for the opportunity and wanted to just kind of quickly review some of my own research. So just to start, I have a paper that just was recently published called Agenda Seeding that looks at protest in the 1960s. And I wanted to kind of try and situate that work in the kind of contemporary protest movement. And so what I wanted to sort of begin with is sort of why are we in this moment of widespread protest, right? And it will not be a surprise to anyone that, of course, these images shot by Darnella Floyd are Darnella Frazier, a 17-year-old young woman who captured the killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, has had a really profound effect on our contemporary discourse and contemporary politics. And I wanted to kind of situate this moment in a longer history of these kinds of images. So in 1992, this is the Los Angeles police force beating Rodney King. And the images of this video, again, shot by a citizen journalist, essentially, had a profound effect on Americans, that is to say, white Americans' understanding of how policing was different for African Americans than what they understood the role of the police was. And we can go one step further back to Emmett Till. And I wanted to sort of really kind of situate the entire conversation in this particular story, not just of Emmett Till, young man who was killed by two vigilantes for allegedly being rude to a white woman in a little corner store. The murder, the lynching of Emmett Till was not just a horrible, horrific incident, but something which Mamie Till, here Emmett's mother, did something quite remarkable with. And what I mean by that is she took something that was a kind of an unspeakable tragedy and turned that into a profound kind of activism. So these images are published in Jet magazine. She was initially told by the undertakers in the South that they would not send Emmett's body to the North. She fought tenaciously to have it, the body shipped. The undertaker's agreement was that it would be a closed casket agreement. She resisted that and had an open casket funeral, and then brought the media in. And the reason I wanted to kind of just talk about those things is that Mamie Till had this insight, which is that if people can see the injustice, then that has the potential to be transformative. And so what I wanted to kind of focus on were three aspects of what I saw, what we can sort of learn from Mamie Till. One is this process of sort of thinking about how really horrific imagery can nevertheless be mobilized in ways that has real political power. So that's broadly what I call agenda seeding. It's how marginal people can get their ideas that are often excluded from the mainstream media. It's important to note that in 1955, the mainstream media is either in the South pro-segregation or in the North indifferent to the concerns of African Americans. By bringing the story of her son's murder to the media, she changed the conversation in both the Black media and particularly in the white media. She also did what I call sort of venue shifting. She took a local issue where her son was murdered and made it a national issue. She even made it an international issue in as much as this was covered by media around the world. And she did this very profound kind of framing and staging, right? Having these horrific images in in this huge funeral, an estimated 40 to 50,000 people came to see the casket. It had a profound effect on kind of shaping discourse around how it sort of mobilized African Americans and was described by Southern segregationists as propaganda. And in a way, that's right. It was a very powerful kind of propaganda against segregation. And so in the work I do, I look at ways that protesters can use both nonviolent and violent tactics to try and seed their narrative in the media. And I'm going to focus, just because we have a limited amount of time, really on this category here of protesters engaging in a kind of nonviolent resistance. And I'm including Mamie Till as an activist who's thinking about how can she turn this trauma into power. And in particular, when there's kind of state and vigilante violence as a part of that against a kind of nonviolent protester. And what I find is that in the 1960s, what we get is media coverage, again, media that's often been indifferent or hostile to the concerns of African Americans, becomes very focused on rights. And we see a kind of moving of public opinion towards, in this case, the kind of the Black aligned coalition, which in the mid-1960s was the Democrats. So again, the process is some way of turning kind of media into sympathetic coverage that then changes politics in a bunch of different ways. So I'm just going to quickly look at how that worked in the 1960s and then look at a little bit of how that might be playing out now. So what we see here, I want to focus on two kinds of moments, but let me just explain what we're looking at, right? So this is 1960 to 1968 are the years. The green line here is public opinion, where Americans are asked, what's the most important problem in America? And they answer civil rights. This is a series of polls taken, sort of sporadically. And what we see is there's a big spike in concern about civil rights between earliest 1963 and late 1963. On the other axis, here we have the number of protesters per month. And what we can see is there's also, as the March on Washington happens, there's a big increase in concern about a big increase in protest activity. And that these two lines, or these two trends, sort of move together. It drops very quickly, but within a year we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and again, civil rights jumps to the top. And in particular, I think this moment here, Selma, is a echo of what we're looking at today. So in Selma, the protest movement strategically went to Selma, Alabama, where there was a police chief who had a hair trigger for violence. And in footage that was covered nationally, we saw protesters engaging in direct action, a walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, getting brutalized by vigilantes. And again, a big spike in concern about civil rights, and within 5 months, passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so I think what we're witnessing potentially now is something like Selma, state and vigilante brutality that leads to a big increase in public opinion around, a big increase in saying this is an important issue. How does this happen? What I find in the 1960s is that media coverage, I collected about 275,000 headlines, front page headlines from the 1960s. And what I found is that, so just to explain this, there's a lot going on here. The purple line here is protest activity. And we can see as protest activity is going up, this grayish line, headlines with civil rights, also goes up, and also public opinion about civil rights, that same data we were just looking at, goes up. As protest activity goes down, headlines go down, public opinion goes down. Then again, we get that spike around passage of the Civil Rights Act. We get the spike around Selma. And that pattern suggests, and I do other kinds of tests, that protests are shaping media and that media is in turn shaping public opinion, right? We should remember that almost nobody directly observes a protest. If they're changing their minds about what matters in politics, it's probably because they've seen it in the media. So now what I want to do is think about how is that playing out in the current moment. And what we see, this is from a researcher, a scholar, Michael Haney. He just shared this with me this morning on Twitter. And what he's showing is a ratio of the word protest to politics in monthly media coverage. And what we see is that protests are spiking around other protests, say the Iraq War, or Occupy Wall Street, or the Women's March, or Unite the Right on the right, a right of center white supremacist march. None of them have generated as much attention in the media as the Justice for George Floyd protests. So that's a very dramatic, in the last 2 decades, this is as big as he's seeing in these data. So that suggests, one, that these protests are able to they are changing what the media are talking about. And then the question is that influencing public opinion? And here, this is from the New York Times. What they find is if you look at attitudes about Black Lives Matter, right, in the last 2 weeks, American voter support for Black Lives Matter movement increased almost as much as it had in the preceding 2 years, right? So this is a trend in the positive versus negative affect towards Black Lives Matter. And what we see is a really big increase in the positive affect towards Black Lives Matter in the wake of these massive George Floyd protests, all of which suggests to me that we're in a moment where, and I'm going to stop sharing now, we're in a moment where the patterns we saw in the 60s may be playing out as well in the current era, where protests that are able to get coverage that draws attention to state violence and vigilante violence against African Americans can do a lot of work to shape the public narrative and to move public opinion. And it's still too early to say how that influence on public opinion will move to policy. But if the lesson of the 1960s bears out, if what we saw in the 1960s bears out, then we should expect that there will be meaningful policy changes because there's this large coalition, this broad coalition of Americans who have now aligned themselves with the cause of justice for George Floyd. Thank you.
Robyn, do you want to take it on?
Hi, I'm happy to be here. I wanted to center my commentary around the history that I center on, which is the history of the radical Black freedom movement. In particular, I look at the history of the Black Panther Party as an organization. And it's really, I think, a lot of context, I think it brings to this moment that we're in today, because of course, although there are so many striking differences between where we are now and the movements of the 1960s, there's also been a lot of parallels that have been drawn between the movements. So I wanted to just share some insights from the Panthers' history, especially around the larger framework of state violence and how they conceptualized state violence, how they shifted the conversation from police violence to a larger understanding of different violences in society, including thinking about the international context for violence, as well as thinking about how they use different languages to speak to their constituencies, to speak to the world, and how they were able to successfully gain a global audience for their message. So that's what I wanted to center my comments around. So I'm going to just share a few images to give us a nice sense of some of the artwork of Panther visual artist Emory Douglas, who hopefully people have heard of before. He's very well known. Hopefully you've seen his work before. So Emory Douglas. Okay. So I wanted to start off by saying that Oakland, California, like many urban areas, was plagued by police violence. The Panthers were founded in 1966, but way before that time, right, there was a long history of police violence before that. So I wanted to go over that history just a little bit so you can get a sense of what led to the emergence of the Panthers and the kind of ground that they tilled, the kind of spade work that they sort of arose from, as well as the spade work that they did for organizations that came about after them. So police brutality was a persistent problem in Oakland history, especially in the areas where the Black population lived. The police force was overwhelmingly white, and many were recruited from the deep South. The police force enforced the racial status quo. it was really a reflection of the way that notions of law and order and what was order was really very racialized in the story of Oakland's history. This is not different from the story of many Black communities and communities of color around the country. So Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the two young men who started the Black Panther Party, arose from that context. Before they started the organization in 1966, indeed, while they were still young people, their elders were organizing and mobilizing around this question of police violence. So they were mobilizing in different ways, whether it be writing letters to the newspaper. If you look in the Black newspapers of Oakland, California at that time, there were many articles that were written complaining about the reality of police brutality, complaining and giving testimony to the realities of what it felt like to exist in these urban spaces and dealing with the type of social control that was there, that was being meted out at the hands of the police. And also talking about potential ways to fight back, whether it be through organization, mobilization, etc. In 1931, there was a federal review of the police in Oakland, which acknowledged that there was justifiable evidence for the cry and the charge of brutality on the part of the police. And it really, I think, echoed the type of oral history and oral testimonies that communities of color were giving in Oakland. And it's important to note that women and men were giving these testimonies, right? That women and men were being harassed by the police. In particular, if you look into the accounts, you'll see as many accounts about attacks on men, harassment of men, as women. So for example, an account of a woman who was arrested in front of a police station on a protest, and she was attacked in a way that was sexual and, revealed her undergarments and things like that. So really tying into the sexualized ways and the threat of sexual violence that was always an undercurrent in the way that Black women oftentimes interacted with these state structures of repression. Right. It's important to know that, because I think sometimes our conversations and what's in the historical record are two different things. The historical record will tell us that Black women were telling their stories, the news was covering their stories were there about police brutality. So when the Panthers emerged in 1966, founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who were two community college students at the time, they very much had police brutality in their minds. Right. They had a lot of other things on their mind about housing, about education, about the war in Vietnam. That was the reality at the time, and the draft. Right. They were also very much concerned with the questions of freedom, the economic exploitation of businesses in their communities as well. So they created a broad program, but police brutality was a daily concern that they honed in on by focusing on these community patrols. Now, Emory Douglas was an early joiner of the Black Panther Party, became their visual artist, and created resounding and very well-known images that became known all around the world. They're still very distinctive today. You'll note his image is in the headlines because of its association with the recent Netflix movie, The Five Bloods. So here is one of the images of the police as pigs. The Panthers call police pigs to dehumanize them, to very much to shift the power balance between the Black community or the communities that were oppressed and the police force, right? And they describe the police as in a particular ways. And many Panthers had this little phrase memorized, right? This idea of a creature that bites the hand that feeds it, masquerading as a victim of an unprovoked attack. And this depiction of the police as pigs became part of the cultural language of the 60s, and certainly remains with us today. So that's, I think, one clear way that we can think about their way of sort of trying to use language to shift power, to use an image to also paint a different reality, as well as to put and spotlight a longstanding issue and make it into something that people would rally around in a concrete way. Now, they were very clear that the pig was not just the police in your local neighborhood, right? So they made that connection. So this is another image created by Emory Douglas, where the pig is wearing the stars and stripes associated with American iconography. And it says, get out of the ghetto, get out of Africa, get out of Asia, get out of Latin America. Very much connecting the ways in which the police forces in those communities were very much connected to the actions of the military. And we see that in 2020, people are making those very same connections. In 2020, this uprising that we're living through today is very much connected to a global upsurge, right? When people are protesting in the many countries that they are around the world, they're not just in solidarity with what's happening in the US, they are raising their own concerns, their own issues about unaddressed histories of racism and colonialism in their local context, right? So the Panthers, by thinking about and projecting this ideal of the pig not just being the local police, but connecting the actions of the police to the military and to the military's actions, not just in the United States, but outside the United States as part of that, they tried to make that internationalist connection. This is very, very important because very much we're in a moment that's just not framed by what's possible in terms of US politics. We're seeing kind of a global shift happening, just the way that in the 1960s, those movements were framed by the US war in Vietnam, by African decolonization, by liberation struggles in Latin America, right? We can think about that in this context as well. The Panthers and Emory Douglas also used art to be very critical of capitalism, right? This is also very clear. We're hearing calls for systemic change, right? And the question is, well, what is the system, right? And it's interesting that we're living through a moment where the moment of police violence and brutality that we all saw, right? And many of us, I think, carry around in our hearts so many other scenes, right? Crowded, our hearts are crowded with those other scenes that we have seen, right? Of other brutal moments. Right? This is just the latest that we've seen. And from seeing that, others have come after that. So the Panthers were very much saying that, listen, this is not just about the actions of the police, right? Or even just the actions of the military. This is about a system, right? And we hear these cries for systemic change. What is the system? The Panthers very much argued that the system was a system of economic exploitation and a system of capitalism, right? So this is an image that Emory Douglas created that I like to share because it kind of highlights how they were thinking about the role of businesses, which, by the way, in recent weeks have been so quick to tell us of their support for Black Lives Matter and send us coupons or flag, their content under the Black Lives Matter banner. But we know that they are tied into legacies and histories of exploitation, right? So thinking about how companies, Exxon, Xerox, Allstate, Pan Am, right, Chevron, in their day, and thinking about connecting it to the president at the time, right? So that was another thing that they were doing in terms of using their art to bring that through the means of collage as well. Collage literally was a way of literally patching things together, right? So they're patching the stock exchange accounts with this invisible hand, very visible hand, right? And all of these companies' branding as well. And then finally, the Panthers also had a very clear sense of the future, right? Moving through the future. They were an organization that was very interested in survival. They didn't take that lightly. I think as an organization, like many young people who started becoming part of this revolutionary movement, they may not have assumed that they would live through it or even to see the changes that they were promoting or thinking through. But they also started to think about survival and the bread and butter issues that people had to deal with, right? It was one thing to be thinking about ending capitalism and, you know, these moments of long-term change, but they understood that people needed food on the table. They needed clothes on their backs. They needed healthcare. They needed, you know, to get from point A to point B. So they created and they institutionalized a system of community survival programs. One of the most well-known one is of course, their Breakfast for School Children program, but there were many, many others. I wanted to close with this image, also because it's using a Black woman to kind of send their message, but this is a survival nurse, as Emory Douglas called it, but she's wearing a cap from the People's Free Health Clinic, and she is literally holding up all of the Panthers, or many of the Panthers, community programs at the time, from the bus that was taking people to prison to visit relatives, to the clothing that was being given away, to shoes, the button that says "I'm a revolutionary," right? Challenging, you know, people that might say that if you engage in bread and butter issues, that you're not engaging in a revolutionary act. But the idea was to remind people that feeding people, getting them from point A to point D could be a revolutionary act if you did it in a way that was critical, in a way that was moving people forward critically. And you'll notice also the gun holstered at their side, right, at her side, thinking about the continued commitment to ideas of armed self-defense and critiquing this idea of violence and who gets to deploy violence and whose violence is righteous violence and whose violence is condemned or not condemned. And we saw that in just some of the public political commentary accompanying some of the actions, both of the police, of people who were protesting in ways that were within and outside of the law over these past, now over a month. So I wanted to end there and to say that this is really an unprecedented moment in US history. And I think that we can draw on the history of the Black radical tradition to really give us a strong sense of how we can move forward in this moment critically, right? I think we can be informed by the past. We don't have to repeat it, right? We can't repeat it, right? But we can be informed by some of the ways that we can draw on perhaps the wellspring that activists in the past provided. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And that's what I wanted to offer.
Thank you. And I think we'll go on to brontë.
Thank you. I feel whelmed by and grateful for what Omar and Robyn have shared, and thank you for your scholarship and for your offering. I feel activated, and I feel the grief, and I feel so much praise for the lineages that have come before us to allow us to be gathered here today, to reflect on the deep work and the deep soil that's been prepared for us to step in and continue the prayer. Thinking of Tyee Moraga writing in This Bridge Called My Back, how important it is to have a firm foothold in political memory so that we can step into the future with that deep insight, honoring our foremothers who've prepared that. So thank you all for that reflection. I wanted to share, before we share a film from my organization, Led to Life, I just want to share this image of this gazebo that Tamir Rice was killed under. Just gonna go into full screen. Maybe we just pause and bear witness to this gazebo and to reflect on this 12-year-old that was killed by Timothy Lehman in Cleveland. And it has migrated. So this image is of this gazebo migrating to Stony Island Arts Bank, where Samaria Rice, Tamir's mother, requested the Astor Gates and his rebuilt foundation to take the gazebo elsewhere and to caretake what they were calling material memory. In her settlement with the city of Cleveland, they were going to destroy the gazebo, and she had this foresight to demand that she actually have access to it, which makes me think of what Omar brought up around maybe Till, the wisdom to say, let the people see what I've seen, and this call from Black mothering and the wisdom of mothering to call in accountability and to demand people witness and remember the trauma, that they were going to try to disappear this gazebo. And she said, no, I want it. So what they did was they disassembled this gazebo and they brought it back to Stony Island Arts Bank for some time, and they called it Objects of Care, Material Memory, Material Memorial. And it wasn't, at the time, it wasn't assembled like this. They deconstructed it and had the elements of the gazebo gathered in a space that you couldn't quite get into with an interview playing between Theaster and Samaria. And even all of the material memory of the ribbons and the altar items and the teddy bears and the tape and the posters. To think about what happens to these sites of trauma and how these places and geographies where Black people are killed and harmed reverberate. That our environments, as Dr. Sean Ginwright says, are transition from just a localized personal experience of PTSD to an environment that is impacted by persistent traumatic stress. And some of our work at Led to Life is thinking about how the violence and trauma in the afterlives of slavery, what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, is that we're traumatized from connection with our environment. And our Black liberation movements have often been compromised by the trauma of capitalism. And so how do we ecologize the Black liberation movement and step into lineages of, like what Robyn is bringing up with the Black Panther movement, of reconnecting people to their food, to their land, to ceremony, and what grief work is necessary to attend to the wake, what Christina Sharp calls the wake of this trauma. This moment where I feel so activated, and so many are so activated with Black unrest, and how do we give the space to imagine otherwise? So the film that you're about to see is Led to Life gathering last year in Oakland, occupied Ohlone territory. We're closing out the Anti-Police Terror Project March, a local anti-police terror organization. They have an annual Reclaim the Radical King March, and we closed out their ceremony in recalling the public Black prophetic tradition, and what I like to bring in the Black feminist prophetic tradition of invoking Harriet Tubman's declaration, "My people are free," that prophetic practice of saying, right in the here and now, my people are free. And how do we come from that prophetic place? What needs to happen in our environment to actually meet that prayer? And how do we imagine what we want after white supremacy is over? What do we want after the police are defunded or the police are abolished? What do we want to feel like? What are our practices together? So this imagery is from that ceremony that night where we invited people to be in a public prophetic practice with us, Anti-Police Terror Project, the mothers of Christopher Lavelle Jones, Dejon Armstrong, Celine Tyndall. You'll also see the mothers of Colby Friday and James Rivera, children who've been killed by young Black people and young Latinx people who were killed by police in Oakland and Stockton. And we gathered in honor of the 10th anniversary of Oscar Grant's murder, where we transformed guns into the molds that were the stars above Oscar Grant the evening he was murdered. And you'll see the images go between Oakland and Coast Miwok Territory, Point Reyes, where we imagine the earth collaborating with us in our liberation work. And all of the audio that you'll hear is from that evening, from the soundscape of that evening. Okay, thank you.
I say to you, there is no economic violence in our town. Ashe. I say to you, everybody is housed. Ashe. I say to you, there are no jails or prisons, or as we call them, American concentration camps. Ashe. I say to you that we invest in prevention, not criminalization. Ashe. I say to you that all of our mothers, our fathers, our people, our children have enough to eat. Ashe. I say to you that our children are being educated in the ways of our ancestors. Ashe. I say to you, we no longer rely on outside militarized forces to keep peace in our community, but we keep it for ourselves. Ashe. I say unto you that the generations and generations of trauma from white supremacy and capitalism and imperialism and militarism have been healed. Ashe. I say to you that the people govern each other with laws of justice, equity, and humanity. Ashe. I say to you that we are living in the times that we have spent our lives fighting for. Ashe. 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 And so it is. I love you, Oakland. your breath, your conscience, a collective voice, this power of one, like you know that you've known forever. You are the one. I am 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 the one.
We in our bodies entrusted to our flesh. We created the initiations to prepare us to hold the earth while they are birthing us anew. We learn to dance inside the contractions, learn to shake and shapeshift. Ancestors taught us to stir, swirl, drop it low and close to the ground. Orbit our own flesh, to fall in love with our body and the many shapes they can take. The earth taught us to do this as they got warmer from ignorance and waste. As the weather became more erratic, as disaster was declared, we listened to the earth and followed suit. While they became enraged, inflamed, a fugitive in their own body, we listened as they asked us to heal ourselves, to bring the huracan and terremoto to our center. We started to shake and rage and shift shape as a reflection of the earth taking their body back. We danced ourselves back home to source, till there was no memory of separation. Because this is not our apocalypse. We have already been revealed to ourselves. This is not our apocalypse. We have come to lay white supremacy to rest. This is not our apocalypse. My people are free. This is not our apocalypse. We have come to lay patriarchy and greed to the ground. This is not our apocalypse. We are giving it back over to the soil to do their work. This is not our apocalypse. We are just offering the eulogy. This is not our apocalypse. We are the doulas. We have been to the mountaintop. We saw that, in truth, the earth itself had become the nigger of the world. They were unearthed and howling, ripped open to make weapons to take black folks from this earth. We have been to the mountaintop. The mountaintop said they don't want nothing to do with that. So we're crying out with the stones. We are crying out with the soil and the volcanoes. We came to bring the weapons back to the earth because we found that reparations also meant we had to repair with the earth, our only real home. We wanted our breath back, so we took our breath back with the artifacts of war. We brought the oaks back. We undammed the creeks. We planted medicine everywhere. The chorus of other beings who miss the trees are singing with us. The ecology done returned. The earth wasn't a metaphor. We had to really ask them, what do you need? Trusting that our needs will always be in alignment with their health and wellness. Well, we were scared. We wondered, where is black me after everything is laid to rest? If they lay down their guns, if they lay down their chapels and governments, who do I become when they use my body as the scaffolding for their violence? But then I surrendered, asked, will I become you again, sweet soil? Ocean, will I be like you, full and everywhere? We keep our breath flowing so our joy can come home. We undam our chests. Our joy, like water, like salmon, got perfect memory. It is always on its way. We always on our way. We always been the way. My people are free. My people are free. My people are free. My people are free.
Thank you.
Brontë, thank you so much for sharing that powerful film. And thank you so much, Robyn and Omar, for just sharing your research and your scholarship with us. So I just have a couple of questions for you all. In really thinking about the Black liberation movement and the fight for Black people to, be liberated from all forms of bondage, including, the injustices, social, political, economic, religious, how far do you think we have come in terms of that Black liberation movement? And this question is for anyone that would like to answer.
And I would ask the panelists to please turn on their video if they can. Thank you.
So maybe I can direct this question to Robyn.
Sure. I was reading a piece by Audre Lorde today. I was thinking about her quote that says something like, I don't believe in single issue movements because we don't lead single issue lives. And when I looked up the quotation, I found that it was part of a speech where she was reflecting on the 1960s in the 1980s and talking about how far we had come or not come by then. So it's an excellent question. I think it's important to think about, just the breadth of and the distance, between where we've been and where we are as a people. When I think about some of the issues that are on the table today, and I think about some of the demands of the 1960s, there's an alignment there around housing, around education. Right now, there's a renewed movement. The student movement that has always been there has gained visibility. We see a movement for shedding light on the conditions that people face who are queer, right? Who oftentimes get left out of these conversations about futurity and what liberation needs to look like and who needs to be, what leadership looks like, right? So I feel like in some ways it feels like we've come a long way, right? Because opportunities feel different. Like it feels like there's more space in some ways to move, to act, to push, to claim, to lay stakes. But then, there's some visceral ways that I feel just the weight of my parents, of my grandparents. I feel that in a real way, in this moment. I feel a sense of mourning for my children. And I only have one child. I mean, my collective children. I'm thinking about just the children, the children that I see out there, and people post pictures of young children and their signs, and it's beautiful, but it's tragic. Another generation on the front lines. I don't want there to be yet another generation on the front lines. I want the war to be won. And I think understanding that we have not come far enough from where we've been is part of that. There's a lot of self-congratulations. There's a lot of a sense of space a sense of distancing from the horrors of the past. It's not as bad as it was. Well, clearly it's very bad. You wouldn't have told me, as someone who watched the Rodney King beating, that we would be here right now with live YouTube videos, cell phone videos of, this type of brutality and murder, at our fingertips. So yeah, we have not come far enough. There is far to go. And getting to the root is important, because otherwise we're just treading the same ground. It feels like we've come far, but perhaps it's the treading of the same ground. And I do think that there's something about the radical imagination and doing something different. There's a lot of things that are happening today that many people would have said, oh, that's impossible. That, that would have taken a lot of time. But the time is now. And I think that there's an understanding that the stakes are high. And on the one hand, I think there's an attempt to kind of co-opt and damp down the radical edge of what's happening now. And on the other hand, I see some really radical conversations that were happening, that have been happening, that have been led by, people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, queer people, that have been happening now in the sun, where they belong, where they deserve to be. Our theorists, our brilliant theorists are being heard, right? And that's what needs to happen. That is what needs to happen. And that's going to put us in new direction. And maybe that's going to be the type of progress that needs to happen, that puts us in some real movement forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spencer. Just have one other question, and this is for Dr. Waslow. So you talked a little bit about just the civil rights movement that kind of began with Mamie Till, and talking about how it lasted for about 5 months, and what we got from that was the civil rights movement, passage of that. And so looking at, I think, some of these unintended consequences of the Civil Rights Act, I think one of them is just looking at the fact that Black entrepreneurship, Black business ownership, how much it has gone down in the last 30 years. And some of that can be attributed to the Civil Rights Movement passage. And I know we mentioned not making some of those past mistakes or really being aware of them. Any way that we can kind of be on the lookout for maybe some of these unintended consequences that could potentially come up out of our current climate and the current protests that are happening in our country?
Thank you for that question. My work primarily focuses on the 1960 to 1972 era. And I think, just to echo maybe some of the points made before, I think one of the things that can be really hard to appreciate is slow change that is happening incrementally. And that, and so I think I want to offer sort of partly some encouraging signs, and also speak to some of the more depressing signs, right? So on the one hand, I think what we've seen over the long run, this speaks both to things like entrepreneurship and political gains, is a kind of tale of two cities for Black America. So on the one hand, we've seen this dramatic increase in the size of the Black middle class. On a bunch of measures, we see African-American progress in college attainment, things like income for that middle class. We see a real flourishing of the, say, let's call it the upper 40%. And at the same time, for the bottom, say, 50%, there are these real long-run challenges of things like massive expansion of the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, a wealth gap that remains devastatingly large at 10 to 15 times more wealth in white families than Black families. And so it's kind of a tale of two cities. And I haven't seen data that suggests Black entrepreneurship has decreased over the last 50 years. It's not an issue I've studied closely, but my sense is that, in fact, with the growth of that Black middle class, has been a real flourishing of Black entrepreneurship. But it's in a context where, again, the wealth gap remains shockingly large. And for the bottom half of Americans, bottom half of Black Americans, we're seeing a kind of, a sort of tidal wave of multiple factors: deindustrialization, again, mass incarceration, and other forces, schools that are unable to really give people a step up. And that combination of forces has meant that the American dream is there for some of African America, but for much of Black America, it's not a reality. And so What I am sort of cautiously optimistic about, though, in terms of what we're seeing in this current wave of protest, is one other thing that's very different from the 1960s, which is that the kinds of successes that were achieved by protest movements in the 1960s were achieved by building a coalition of, union members and African Americans and clergy and white liberals and some white moderates. And what we're seeing now is a significant increase in the number of whites, particularly white liberals, who say racial equality is a serious concern for them. And that's the kind of foundation upon which change can happen. If African Americans are 14% of the population, political success will depend on, for better or for worse, coalitions. And we're seeing I think a real change in public opinion among whites that speaks to the possibility of more substantive change in coalition.
I suppose my first question is the role of violent protest or not, but just the question of more generally how media chooses to frame violence and how that translates into public policy. So I will leave that to both Robyn and Omar, but then I would love for Brontë to also speak to some of the images and ceremony that you've surfaced, and how, I guess, Black thrivance is about finding these other places of sanctuary, which really comes across powerfully in your video.
Because I just spoke, maybe Robyn wants to go next.
Sure, I was actually going to let Brontë go. I think the emotional weight of the video and the provocations there are really, really, really rich. I don't know if you feel able to dive in first, and then we can follow up.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was like, whew. Just remembering those, remembering actually being there and seeing, just feeling all of those people, and especially the mothers who are still organizing against police terror. One of the moms that was in the film, when the scenes are at the ocean or in the forest, Beyond Smith, she actually met, whose son James Rivera was killed in Stockton, California. She met another woman who's in the film, Denise Friday, whose son Kobe Friday was also killed by Stockton police. She met she met at the site where Kobe was killed, waiting for someone from his family to come, and she waited for a good 12 hours, knowing that at some point his mother would be there or someone from his family was going to be there. And now they are in this very deep friendship. And I think a lot about another woman, Monteria Robinson, who we worked with in Atlanta in ceremony. We held a week of ceremonies in honor of the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. And Monteria Robinson, whose son Jamarion Robinson was killed by the U.S. Marshals in Georgia. I remember when we first got on the phone, she said that she had not been able to grieve her son yet because she had no space to do any grief work, because she was, they left her with the financial and spiritual and emotional debt of murdering her child. And I think about that debt and that trauma and that debt and that pain, that is, and the atmospheres of violence that we're contending with. And yeah, the very little ways, actually, Black people in protests, the very little ways we're actually even challenging. Like, it's actually very civil what is going on in comparison to the gravity of the trauma. And so it's, just the pain of property being valued over Black life is just, it's so sad. And I think a lot about Cat Brooks and Anti-Police Terror Project. Cat Brooks is the co-founder of Anti-Police Terror Project and an organizer against police terrorism, was a mayoral candidate for City of Oakland in this past mayoral candidacy, and came in second, and was also ED of something called Justice Teams Network. They often use the phrase, all violence is state violence, that even our intercommunal gun violence is a reverberation of the state violence that is happening to Black people. And when I say the state violence, I mean the systemic violence that runs down in all of these insidious ways onto Black people, that manifests in, you know, the work that brought me to Led to Life, a 14-year-old Black child killing my friend who was 21, another Black young person. That actually knowing that the reason that 14-year-old Black child was robbing this 21-year-old was really about a whole lineage and history of trauma and oppression and poverty and pain that had not been attended to. And then bringing that child into the carceral system and not affording them his life in the ways that white children are afforded the question of what happened to you. The fact that someone like Dylann Roof was given so much care after he killed 9 people, that there was time given to him and curiosity given to him. So I think about that phrase a lot, all violence is state violence. I'd be curious to bring that statement to Robyn and Omar about what you think about that phrase, and to continue Brinda's question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that provocation. I think, you know, what I was thinking is about how violence is such a part of the fabric, almost in the air one breathes. And if you think about violence, you think about the violence of colonialism, it shifts what you think violence is. I think sometimes we think about violence as this moment of physical harm that we can kind of see, and there's bodily fluids there, right? Or something like that. But when I think about violence, the violence that accompanies colonialism and its aftermath and its ongoing, you know, nature, when I think about the type of violence that the Panthers felt that they were addressing, like when they were addressing feeding school children, they saw that as an act of self-defense, right? That there was, you know, the violence of these children not being fed in, you know, in a very wealthy country that had the resources to do that. And so their food programs were a way of defending the community from that, right? I think when you shift what violence means, and I feel like there is kind of a shift that I see, maybe I can even lay it on the theorists of, you know, the ordinary intellectuals, the everyday intellectuals, the folks who are, you know, theorizing on Twitter, who are talking about violences and trauma, and who are really, I think, building that intellectual framework, you know, that others can step onto and to amplify with attribution, hopefully, right? To think about how violence becomes such a broad statement, right? So yeah. You know, of course, I think there's the assumption sometimes that the role of the state is to prevent violence, to protect people from violence. And when we think about the state as fomenting violence, when you think about the killing of, you know, people like Fred Hampton and the types of violence that we normalize, whether it be the death penalty, whether it be announcements of the murders of foreign, you know, leaders whose politics or who are, you know, engaged in warfare, that we're engaged in warfare with. We think about the types of violence that gets normalized, whether it's you glancing over your shoulder, hoping that you made it past that police checkpoint You know, you're not going to be pulled over or stopped, or you made it, you know, that sense of that, you know, at any moment, this could be your last day, right? That there's a sense of that here. One police stop, one signal change, Sandra Bland, you know, didn't put on my signal. That could be it for me today. These are the types of everyday violence that doesn't get seen, becomes invisibilized, that people absorb, and that bleed out, you know, that just bleed out in very real ways. So yeah, thinking through this ideal of, you know, the state and the role of the state in all of those, in those violences. And I think, you know, I do think about the new world and how we can unlearn the ways that we use violence as a language, right? In that Audre Lorde essay, she talked about people turning violence on the people closest to them, the violence of the family, right? She talked about that. That was, you know, the pandemic brought that into awareness, right? Of course, feminists and people who'd been social workers and many had, you know, that was not a hidden fact. But all of a sudden, when we had to be locked down in our homes, and it was clear that other people, many people were not safe in their homes, or did not even have homes to be safe in, the question of interpersonal violence took center stage again, right? What about that violence? How do we think about unseating and undoing that violence? So a lot of deep conversations I feel we should be having in these moments. And I feel like when we think about the legacies of Black radicalism, we have to center, you know, feminist traditions. We have to center all of those, else we're not going to get anywhere. Right? We're just not going to get anywhere. Important to know that the movements of the 60s came together: Vietnam, LGBTQI plus, you know, Black Power, the white student movement. There was an upsurge of all of those movements. And today, we have to think about how these movements relate to each other and to liberation, right? What is this renewed feminist movement? How does this, you know, how does that impact how we even have this conversation? There was a huge movement for Black trans lives in Brooklyn, and that was beautiful to see. It was one moment though, right? How can that become the norm? How do we address that violence? We saw the violence of someone being brutally attacked by protesters, I believe, or by I forgot even the scenario, but brutal acts we just become normalized, right? If we want to attack violence, let's attack violence, right? Don't worry about the buildings. Can think about the human beings who are the victims of all of these violences. It's a really complex question.
I want to thank Brontë and Robyn also for those interventions, and in particular think about the all violence is state violence idea. And I think there's something very powerful about that claim, because it helps us to think about, right, sort of in some chain of causation, right, the kind of the first act of violence. If I was interviewed by a Chinese journalist, and she was sort of saying, when did these protests start? And I was like, well, like let's go back to 1619 and think about like the beginning of slavery, and let's think about the kind of chain of subordination, oppression that begins with that, and that people have been resisting for centuries. And at the same time, I also want to complicate a story that all violence is state violence, because I think it has the potential to reduce the amount of agency that we situate in the Black community. And that part of what I have been trying to kind of say with my work is actually activists are making choices, and they are making choices in some cases to engage in acts of direct action where they become objects of violence. And they do that strategically as a way to reveal, as people like King and John Lewis described it, they're dramatizing injustice, right? And you know, and again, I think Mamie Till really does that as the kind of the first most very sort of international way of dramatizing injustice, and to sort of use violence strategically in a way that advances your larger agenda. And I think what's hard about that is that often a protest is doing work on multiple levels. So one way a protest works is it's an act of expression. People are grieving, they are angry, they are enraged, they are mourning, and they need to convey and express and articulate that grief and anger and rage. And you know, even leave the protest aside, we all have moments where we are thinking, do I speak my mind, or do I behave in a way that is more strategic because this person's my boss, or this person's you know, a coworker I'm going to have to deal with, and we then not fully express ourselves and engage in some act of persuasion that in some ways has to constrain our fullness. And I think every protest is struggling with that tension between expression and persuasion. And what we see is that if we prioritize expression, which is a fully legitimate reason to want to go to a protest, it sometimes comes at the expense of persuasion. And so even if we think violence by protesters is legitimate, even if we think resistance, you know, sort of eye for an eye violence against an oppressive state is entirely moral and just, there may still be strategic trade-offs. And that's what some of my work finds. And so just to quickly show one plot with some data from the 1960s. Let's see, yeah, here it is. So this is what, so I showed you public opinion on civil rights before. And now what I wanted to show is, and I'm sorry that this is, let me just freeze it there. This is now similar data. These are events that were coded by other scholars as including protester-initiated violence. That meant there was significant injury, death, or arson, property damage at these events. And if I look at the number of people arrested, these are, again, Black-led protests in the 1960s, and we look at the percentage of the public. This is a moment in America where the public is 90% white. So this is a story about Black political agency and white reaction to that. When we have events where there is significant protester-initiated violence, and to be clear, in the context of state repression, in the context of, you know, in a case like Detroit, the National Guard shoots 14,000 rounds of ammunition in residential areas. So, I mean, significant state violence against African-American communities. Nevertheless, we have also, in a case like Los Angeles, something like 3,000 incidents of arson, many of them in the Black community, and it takes decades to recover from. And what we see more generally, coming back to the public opinion story, is that white public opinion is going up in the summer and down in the winter, and up in the summer and down in the winter. And that's a concern about riots and crime, right? So social control here is just a kind of an umbrella for terms like riots and crime. And the kind of so one question would be, why would this concern be so seasonal? And of course, part of what I think is going on is that the media is, and you can see this here, media is covering these events in using something like a crime script. And so what we're seeing is that instead of focusing on rights, as we saw around the earlier 60s protests, we get narratives in the media that are much more focused on riots and crime. And along with that, we get public opinion that spikes in concern about these issues of social control. And so just to come back now to sort of thinking about these trade-offs, these are impossible trade-offs, right? Are you going to express yourself, the legitimate rage and anger and mourning you might feel? Or are you going to think about playing a kind of multi-step game where you've got to do something, be potentially the object of violence to move public opinion to achieve some larger outcome? And part of what I want to sort of put as part of the story about a kind of relentless state violence is that activists have agency, and we see that throughout the 1960s, and that agency has, there are theories of change embedded in why they're doing one set of tactics or another, and that we can sort of say, well, how did those theories play out? What kinds of things were the consequence of that? And if I'm going to take somebody like Robert Williams, who at one point was the head of both an NAACP chapter in North Carolina and an NRA chapter in North Carolina, if I'm going to sort of take what he says seriously, right? He wrote a book, Negroes with Guns, that was very influential on the Black Panthers. I'm sure, Robyn, you know more about this than I do, right? And somebody who's, you know, thinking really hard about how to make change. Let's consider some of the ways in which these theories played out, and that means both taking, you know, beginning with something like the state violence that mobilizes people to action, but also knowing that people have the ability under incredible constraints to make choices that may that have trade-offs, right? Are you going to emphasize the need for mourning? Completely legitimate. Nobody could deny that. But it might come at the expense of building a coalition. Conversely, building a coalition means holding on to moderates who don't share your sense of anger and rage. And that means compromises in what kinds of outcomes you can achieve. And you might want to privilege the core interests of the community, right? Those are very hard trade-offs, but they don't require us saying that activists are without agency. And so that for me is sort of the one thing I worry about if we say all violence is state violence, is it means that the sort of structure is so dominating that individuals have no ability to make choices. And that's not what I observed in the 1960s, and I don't think it's true now either.
Could I ask one follow-up question to that, Omar? Given that research, you talk about, media narratives in the current moment we're in with multiple sources of media. One could argue, we all have our own echo chambers of social media versus what you saw in your research in the 60s and 70s in terms of that narrative framing for the mainstream in relation to public opinion. And I would welcome everyone to take this on, but I'm just curious, given the multiple sources of news people seem to be feeding into today, is there something distinct about the narrative itself, given where people fall on that political spectrum?
I guess just very quickly, I think it's hard. You're absolutely right that we're in a moment where the media is way more fragmented than it was in the past. At the same time, in the 60s, the media was quite hostile to the civil rights movement too, right? I mean, the Southern press was pro-segregation. The national press was, essentially often content to allow Jim Crow to persist. And so the only media that was really, initially at least, sympathetic to civil rights was the Black press. And so there was a kind of fragmentation then as well, but clearly not as much as there is now. On the other hand, everybody now has a video camera in their pocket. And so what was so remarkable about the footage of the Rodney King beating was that it happened to get captured at all. Whereas now, as horrific as it is, and I agree with, I think it was brontë who talked about, but maybe it was Robyn, I don't remember now, who talked about being able to watch these murders on YouTube. I mean, I can't even bring myself to watch a lot of them. It is too traumatic. But I think it's doing real work in moving public awareness that what was visible to Black America, but invisible or in some ways ignored by white America, is now becoming visible. And so even as the media is fragmented, the fact that you can go to, there's a conservative lawyer who's collected nearly 600 videos of police violence at protests. And in his description, we are now witnessing the police engaging in a riot akin to something like what we saw maybe in Selma. And so those sorts of images, I think, do a lot of work, even if they're not all coming through, 3 channels. And at the same time, it's also early, and it may be that the Fox News narrative will be persistent for 30 or 40% of America, but that other narratives are more visible to people who are consuming other media. And so I think it's still early to say, but the evidence suggests that one 17-year-old young woman, Darnella Frazier, shooting that 8.5, 46-minute killing of George Floyd has done an enormous amount of work to move the culture. I mean, the protests too, and the organizing by Black Lives Matter, but but the ability for a teenager to make media that transforms international discourse is, I think, speaks to how, as fragmented as it is, there's still real power in certain kinds of images and certain kinds of representations of state violence against, in particular, Black people.
I just wanted to add in just, I guess, a reaction, as I'm kind of just thinking that through, it feels like, you know, the trade-offs, right? Because you mentioned trade-offs. On the one hand, we have white America becoming more aware and conscientized and moving. On the other hand, I think there's been a real dramatic impact of seeing these videos on the psyche of people who maybe didn't need to see that to understand what was going on. And I think because there have been so much evidence, let's say, these are lives, right? But okay, there's been so much evidence, quote unquote. And I'll never forget with the Rodney King beating, oftentimes people's response was, well, we don't know what happened before the camera when you know, came on, what he did to maybe deserve that. And I feel like even with Ahmaud Arbery, there was that sense of, well, what did he do? And so I feel like there's always a framing with the visuals that come around, and there's something that happens, and it's hard to say. That's why I feel like there's just something so beautiful about what Brontë offered us, because I feel like it's almost like maybe me as a humanist, I don't have the right words to sort of put into the atmosphere here about the psychic toll of seeing these images play out over and over and over again as a teaching tool for other people to get it. And that's not a response to what you said, Omar, but it's just, I guess it's just a frustration. You know, it's just a sense, it's a weight. And I think it is that weight. And it's that I think is part of that sense of exhaustion. And when you think about where we are right now, and you think about the economic collapse, as we can call it, in terms of what it's been for you know, Black people, people of color, people dispossessed, the economic crisis that they found themselves in. I saw videos, you know, the lines of people lined up for food. Just saw an article about the environmental destruction and new research talking about even life expectancy. It feels like a cycle of death in some ways. And I think about Ruthie Gilmore's description of, you know, racism as a sort of premature death. And I think about just the spectacle of death and how it sort of hangs over, and the pandemic and the death. That also, I think, shapes this moment that we're in some ways as well. I think that is part of the urgency of this moment. That maybe is why some people have stepped up, other people have stepped back, or people, you know, can only do some of it, not all of it. You know, there's a sense of, there's a weight, I think, right now because of all of the things that are being carried. And so I think that's a challenge. On the one hand, there's the need for coalition and alliance. But on the other hand, I feel like sometimes what you have to bear in order to accomplish that begs a question of, you know, worthiness, I guess, or strategy. And instead, I see a lot of people of color sort of type formations gathering storm. I saw Black folks stepping in for Asians when it was the Chinese virus and they were being, discriminated against. I saw some solidarity happening across that way. I mean, I think there's lots of different alliances. I'm not sure of the percentages and how that may play out in terms of the larger political landscape, but thinking about just different strategies that could be pursued as well in the quest for transformation.
Let me agree fully that this strategy of direct action in which activists are the object of violence is, you are absolutely right to emphasize it. There's a psychic toll, but people get injured, people get killed, right? It's an exceedingly hard strategy to maintain. What we saw in the 1960s, I think, is that seeing these images of your kinfolk being brutalized was itself a radicalizing experience for people. And that can be good, but it can also make it hard to hold a movement together. And so I don't highlight that particular approach, and I apologize for not emphasizing the cost of that more. I think you're absolutely right that it's both an effective strategy when it can work, but it's an exceedingly demanding, it's an unreasonably demanding strategy. There is some good news in that it's not the only way to get the media to portray a movement sympathetically. So there are everything from celebrities attending protests to ACT UP, the HIV/AIDS activist group that was fighting for recognition and research funding for people with AIDS. They did a stunt at one point, which was funny, where they took a giant condom and put it over the home of Senator Jesse Helms, who was a real barrier to progress on getting funding. They made sure media was there, and they humiliated Jesse Helms in a funny way that made their point. And so it's not that sympathetic media has to come from this kind of horrific subordination. It's just that's often been one very powerful path for the Black community. But I agree, it's brutal and in often ways unsustainable. And so it has to be, to your point, married with a kind of care that allows people to recover from that trauma, and also probably married with other kinds of tactics that allow people to experience joy and, to dance at some protests and to be tear gassed at others, and to have all of that be in service of the larger cause.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to see if Brontë, you had anything to add before we move forward to audience questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really grateful for your comments, Omar and Robyn, and grateful for the complication of that what I read as a meme that has come from that group for the sake of brevity, to kind of think about how do we widen our imagination about how the impact of state violence or colonialism, et cetera, has informed how we strategize or how we react, or informed our behavior, or informed how we relate to one another, which I think is an important invitation and provocation. But yeah, I also agree and long for a multitude of tactics and relational activism that's meeting the spectrum of ways we're harmed, and for those to be in more conversation with one another so that we can move at different relationships to time. There's this thing of like, how do we meet this direct action, and then how do we go into this vision that you were talking about, Robyn, from the Black Panthers of the future and of our livability and what we want after this, and how do we hold all of that constellation of movement building work at different time scales, and be in conversation with one another about that, because sometimes the strategies have often been siloed from one another, and they fight against each other. This is why we have this narrative of Malcolm or Martin being separate. versus thinking about how their strategies influenced and supported and nurtured one another. And I just wanted to signal in the comments, Robyn, that you shared around just the trauma and the psyche. It was making me think of a piece, a play written by Shanaka Hodge, Black playwright and screenwriter from Oakland, where she, I'm forgetting the name of the play at this moment, but the main character is a Black man who is agoraphobic. He has the fear of leaving his home. And he became agoraphobic after the Rodney King beatings. And it's this journey of his story of agoraphobia that he saw after the Rodney King beatings he saw as a child. And then it goes into a New Year's resolution in 2009 where he decides he's going to leave the home for the first time. And he lives in Oakland. And he's at Fruitvale Station the night that Oscar Grant is killed. It's this very powerful piece on the that psychic toll, where I can feel in myself the history of right now, the Great Migration and Black folks leaving the Jim Crow South, and these Black people and ancestors and descendants of Black people who left and went to the Midwest, and how the Midwest right now is this site of, again, of Black unrest. And me leaving Oakland right now, I'm not in Oakland, I'm out in country parts of California, because I can feel how my own agoraphobia and my own sensitivity and my own pain. So I'm just curious how I really hear that need, and how protest is our only imagination for the site of mourning, because we've lost cultural traditions to mourn and to grieve and to hold death. And so how do we reintroduce those practices, which is a prayer of lead to life, so that our strategies toward liberation can be more effective, so we can hold our mourning and our grief and our prayer, so that there's more psychic freedom to think about those tactics. So I'm just grateful for how my mind and heart is opening during this time.
Thank you so much, Brontë, for that. That was just, I think, really beautiful the way you put it and summarized it all. So I have an audience question for Dr. Spencer. Thank you so much, Dr. Robyn Spencer, for your presentation. I greatly appreciate the artwork that shows the internationalist dimension of the Black Panthers. This internationalism was very strong in the 1950s through 70s, among other groups as well. There are some signs of it today, but do you think the internationalist dimension has been diminished compared to the political climate and mobilization in that context?
Thank you for the question. I do think, it was interesting to me that Spike Lee's The Five Bloods kind of came into our popular imagination at this moment in history, and sort of reminding us of and bringing Vietnam back into the conversation, and bringing sort of the international in a way that is sort of centered in that history of the 1960s. In a way, we've kind of been hearkening, I think, back to the domestic part of that history, but I think that film invites back in the international segment of that history. I see a real connection. I think whether it be through democratic forms of media, like social media, like Twitter, for example, and connections between activists on the ground here in the US and activists in other countries, sort of sharing tips about how to cope with different things that people are dealing with on the front lines of these demonstrations, or whether it be kind of a larger sense awareness of US militarism and the way that it's had an impact on the experiences of people of color in the United States, or even the role of corporations or security forces or people who make the tear gas and the vests, and the role of flashbangs in different parts of the world. I think there's been a real sort of sense of a global sense of that the strategies and tactics that are being used here are also directly connected to kind of a global militarized structure. And there are many great scholars who've written about sort of, policing globally. I think that could give and provide more detail there, but I definitely think that that's one way I would sort of say yes. I think the Palestinian struggle in many ways, I think, has become part of the radical imagination of this generation, the way that Vietnam was for the generations of the 60s, maybe not as directly connected in the sense of the draft and you having to think about your body on the front line. But the question of Palestine, I think, comes up in these circles of activists over and over again in ways that I think speak to its ongoing relevance as an area of both analytical connection in terms of thinking about the US in terms of colonialism, ongoing colonialism, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, as well as making those connections. Like I went to a fabulous demonstration, which was the remade Puerto Rican Day Parade, where people, from different communities, whether it be Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Mexico, lots of different places all came together to march in support of Black Lives Matter, acknowledging the Blackness that courses through those communities, that's part of those histories and cultures. So situating Blackness at the center of so many different sites and worlds. I've seen amazing photographs, like I saw a photograph of Palestinian Black folks taking a knee, right, and putting that image into the world. So I think, yeah, those connections are being made, and not just through the dragging down of those, the people involved in the slave trade. I think that's part of it. I think thinking about the connections forged through struggle, not just through being part of this, connection in that way, right? Not this history of exploitation, but history of struggle and resistance as well.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Robyn. Next question, and this I think can possibly be directed to Dr. Waslow. Thanks for the insightful dialogue. The injustice towards the African-American community is deep-rooted in society and will need a systemic strategy to curtail the repetition of brutality every few decades. We can draw an inspiration from India that worked on altering the discrimination narrative within the caste system by providing access to education to the lower caste families. Is there any master plan, community service, or governance that ensures the African-American community could make sure that the children are supported until they are adults? We have to begin the change within us to reverse the history in our favor.
So I very much am interested, kind of echoing some of of Robyn's last point and the last question, of thinking about what can we learn from what's happened abroad? How do the stories in the US translate or map to other countries? So one of the things it's a little in the weeds, so forgive me, but throughout the paper I talk about dominant groups and subordinate groups, in part because I'm interested in talking about a general pattern of a stratified, a hierarchical society in which there's some group that has power and there's some statistical minority, be they people with AIDS, people with disabilities, or African Americans, who have this challenge of overcoming incredible odds, a discriminatory society, discriminatory media, to try and advance their issues. And certainly the challenges faced by groups around the world, whether it's people maybe of lower caste in India, or people who are sort of second-class citizens in other countries. Palestinians was mentioned before. These are all sort of somewhat analogous struggles, and I think it's worth thinking about, okay, well, what's specific to the US and what's generalizable? And I think one of the things that is, sort of most important about the India-US connection is the ways in which the anti-colonial movement in India profoundly influenced the civil rights movement in the US, right? So Bayard Rustin, who was a really important advisor to Martin Luther King, grew up a Quaker in the United States, had some sort of training as a young person in traditions of pacifism, is influenced by what he sees Gandhi and that movement doing in India, and goes and studies in the 40s with people who are disciples of Gandhi's and brings some of that training back to the United States. And in turn is influential then on the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and King and others. And so one core lesson is that those conversations are already happening cross-nationally. And I think that's really important. We also see, just to draw one other echo, ways in which, protesters in Hong Kong are drawing on both methods that we see in terms of civil disobedience that's happened in the US, but also developing their own methods of, how do we resist tear gas? And that's something that people in Ferguson were then learning to use. And so there's a kind of, in just at the level of how does one resist state violence, lots of cross-national conversations that I think are important not to just, to sort of gloss over. And then in terms of the larger question of like, what are the means to achieve, real meaningful anti-poverty programs in the United States or abroad, I think that's in some ways one of the great challenges of how do we map a phrase like Black Lives Matter, which in its sort of simplicity is something that we've now seen a lot of people get behind. And I don't mean simple in the sense that it wasn't contentious, right? It was quite an unpopular term not that long ago, as I showed in one of those plots. But it also doesn't map clearly to a specific policy. And there are leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement who say these are the things we are committed to. But I think it's going to be a challenge for the movement to turn momentum and public sympathy into specific policy wins. In the 1960s, you had clearer sort of agendas that were something like, we want a Voting Rights Act and you get a Voting Rights Act, or there's a march for civil rights and jobs, right? And at least some of that gets enacted. But I think that the lessons of the 1960s are also encouraging that when you build this kind of groundswell of public support, it really is possible to get policy change. And it's not going to be at the level, I think we've been at this for centuries. We will continue to have to fight this fight for decades. But I also don't want people to take away from the incremental progress the idea that we're not making victories, right? In places like Philadelphia, a milestone was that a progressive district attorney was elected. Around in other parts of the country, we've seen changes in use of force policy. Those are all small in and of themselves, but reflect a sea change from 50 years of basically tough on crime being the only winning strategy. And now we're seeing the pendulum swing against that, and into that shift in public sentiment is, I think, a real opportunity for policies that might chip away at mass incarceration and hopefully do things like the questioner asked, improve the quality of schools, build a better set of sort of structural changes that allow for upward mobility in this country, which is really not something we've succeeded at in the last half century.
So I'd like to, just keeping an eye on time, we have about 10 minutes and we will be ending right on time at 3. So there's a couple of questions in here. I guess one it's a very direct question, so maybe it's a yes or no here. We've got a panelist saying, to Dr. Waslow, do you agree that state violence against the protesters, for example, Bull Connor and Selma, achieves more in the long run than, say, street riots in Detroit in 1968? If you can keep that short, that answer, there's 2 more questions.
So just very quickly, I think it's very important to appreciate that violence by protesters can achieve good outcomes. So for example, we do see evidence that the media pay more attention, whoever is engaging in violence. We do see evidence cross-nationally that states engage in policies that are like anti-poverty policies, but we also see violence tends to be associated with more state investment in repression. So there's a real danger with protester-initiated violence of triggering more state violence. And so I think that, just to come to the end of the question, that you can achieve a lot of the same ends with nonviolent civil disobedience that's met by state violence as when there's protester-initiated violence without the state investing in additional repression.
Great. Thank you. And this question I would ask all the panelists to engage. It is a question that Brontë has posed, but I think Brontë, you will also have some insights into this. So would you like to bring up the question in terms of how you are thinking about it in relation to aesthetics?
Yeah. I was thinking about Dr. Waslow opening with these data visualizations and your work in being able to account for the impact of data and its influences on how we relate to Black life or Black movements. And then I was thinking, Robyn, about your visualizations of sharing Emory Douglas's poster work during the Black Panther movement. And so I'm curious to both of you, and to Dr. Waslow, I was also thinking about Du Bois's data visualizations and data for Black lives, and just how the role of the Black aesthetic communicates or nurtures or supports Black liberation, how you see that happening, and its importance.
Robyn, do you want to go first? I mean, I think the work by Emory is so compelling.
Yes, certainly I think Emory Douglas's work provided another language of protest. It spoke to people, it leapt off the page. It was a whole treatise for people who maybe were not going to read a speech or attend a rally. You could see that poster on a street corner, on a office building, or peeking out to you from a storefront, and you could get something about politics. You could laugh, right? He used humor a lot, and I think we've seen a lot of humor being used, whether it be the ironic humor of Black Twitter, or the folks who have made music out of the protest experience, or people who have danced their way out of fatigue and trauma, or through fatigue and trauma, or despite fatigue and trauma, in order to keep going. So I think we definitely sort of see kind of this aesthetic embrace, for sure. I'm not quite sure what might be this. I feel like this moment is still evolving in so many different ways. I'm not quite sure where it's going to end up. I definitely see young people, I think, using social media in really intriguing and interesting ways in terms of figuring out, challenging the ideal that protests cannot be effective on social media, or that social media is just sort of signing a petition that goes nowhere. We see young people using social media to, become headline news around, Trump's rally and things like that. So I think that there's a lot that's going to shift in terms of how we think about this moment as well. But I think I also see, I see almost like on the one hand, a space for maybe beautiful art and creativity. I also see maybe a push to try to control, monetize as well. That's there, as well as, my Bitmoji now has like a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, like all sorts of corporate branding is happening around the phrase, the T-shirt. It's almost like watching the first Afro wigs come out, you know, in some ways, right? So I think we're also at a moment where this spirit, which is so beautiful and free, is also being seen as a commodity. And it's quite interesting to think about the very real downsides of that in this moment, and how artists on many different levels can push back against that.
Just very quickly, I take great inspiration from Du Bois's that collection of data visualizations from the World's Fair, and so if that echoed, if my plots echoed any of that, I am, you know, you've made my day. And I think the larger point, though, is that I think at the heart of what I see in the 1960s is the possibility that, you know, if there are two ways people gain power, one is through coercion, through force, and another is persuasion. In some ways, you know, your ideas, your voice. That what we saw is, particularly in the early part of the 1960s, that people who are, you know, there's a level of hatred against them in the society that's hard to give words to, were nevertheless able, through words, through rhetoric, to, you know, sort of remake the society. And so if we think of data as a kind of rhetoric, and protest as a kind of rhetoric, and obviously things like art and speech as a kind of rhetoric, that method of making change, that non-coercive way of making change, I think has enormous power. And as an academic, I have no choice but to work in that tradition, but it's one that I think has a very proud record of really transforming American society for the good.
Thank you all so much for that. So we have about 2 minutes left. And so I would like to just kind of maybe incorporate a final question in your closing comments. So someone is asking ways for them to contribute to this movement and get involved if they, you know, are not out there protesting, and if they don't feel that they're active or knowledgeable enough on social media to contribute. Can you say in 30 seconds or less ways that they can contribute, and then also provide us with any closing remarks you have? Can I start off with you, Brontë?
Thank you. I would go to the Movement for Black Lives demands, and they list a number of ways to just support. I think just amplifying Black voices, Black leadership is always great wisdom, and that the most beautiful thing we could do is just to nurture and uplift, and that can be an amazing role. And my closing remarks are just that I wish you all well, and I'm grateful for this. I'm grateful for this time, the wisdom of Dr. Spencer and Dr. Waslow's scholarship, and to contribute, what I could from our images of ceremony. I pray that they nourish you and bring each of you who are on today into other qualities of imagination for what happens after this season. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spencer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Building off of those comments, maybe what I'll say is, if you can, I think self-education is so important, learning history, and also passing that knowledge down to the young people in your life. I think that we don't realize all of the messages that we get. I think sometimes we think, I don't know anything. If you're not actively unlearning racism and histories that exclude people of color and Black people, Indigenous people, then you're getting histories that are centering white people. So what I've started to do is just, like, for example, the quotes that I love, I go back now and I try to find the speech, because I feel like sometimes we just sound bites. Go beyond the sound bites. Find your favorite person that you love to quote and go read their original speech and just keep going from there. Go down the rabbit hole with Black history and learn and pass that learning on to a young person and, you know, multiply it exponentially. I want to thank everyone that came out to listen to this conversation. It was really beautiful to be in community with everyone. I think, you know, it was just amazing to bring together all of our different areas of expertise and our different lens into the past and into this moment. So I really, really appreciate being included. So thank you.
I would echo the gratitude and in particular what Professor Spencer just said about the multiple perspectives. Like I live in this world of analyzing data, and I think it has been for me a gift to be able to hear the ways in which that has strengths and weaknesses. And it's really important to think about how do these things feel and how are people moved by the trauma of these moments, and how are, you know, what do we do with that? And that it's important to think about the ways that that gets manifested aesthetically and also in self-care. So I'm just grateful for all of that. In terms of what I might suggest people do, there was a tweet I saw this morning where somebody used a phrase I really liked, which is, do you think 2 to 3 hours a week is enough for active citizenship? And I thought, active citizenship, that's a really nice way of thinking about what we're supposed to be doing here. We're not just voting once a year or whatever it is. What does it mean to actually be an active citizen? And as a colleague of mine wrote in a new book, politics is for power, right? And so I want you to think about using your maybe 2 hours a week of active citizenship to really changing structures, right? There are land use policies where you live that make it hard for low-income people to live in those areas. There are voting policies in your state that make it hard for people to who have disability or who don't have a car or who don't have a driver's license to vote. And those structures are where a lot of the inequality in our society works. And you as an active citizen can play a role in making those structures more egalitarian. So that's sort of in some ways, both for the audience, but also for myself, a goal to be a more active citizen in the days and months to come.
Well, I'd like to thank you all so much. I mean, such deep gratitude. I know each of you. Actually, I've only met Dr. Waslow virtually, but hopefully he will be joining us at the Claremont Colleges as a colleague. And Robyn, Brontë, Tyee, this has been a really wonderful discussion, heart and mind. And for the audience that participated, thank you. We will get this posted, so it'll be shared more broadly. And with that, I bid you all well. Thank you.